Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today to celebrate International Women's Day 2022, and the theme of which is Break the Bias. I can see that some of you are in meeting rooms, so you're sharing this with your colleagues, and everybody's really very welcome. What we have planned for you today is a very short action-focused session, because people who know me know I like to talk about things, but my real question is always, what do we do when we leave the table? What do we do when we leave the room? So you're very welcome, and we'll get started in just a minute. Just to give you something to think about, I'd like to start with a question or an activity. In your meeting rooms, or if you're by yourself in the chat, can you think about examples of any gender bias you have experienced or witnessed? They could be serious or minor, hugely offensive, or so small and normalised that you don't even feel it's reasonable to protest anymore. Well, we live in a jollier world than I imagine, because there's nothing in the chat. So either we've achieved unbiased workplaces, or nobody's typing in the chat, but it's good. This has happened to me before. I've got a few I prepared earlier. Brilliant, here we come. Yeah, people assuming I'm more junior than I am because of my age or gender. My boss, when I was 35, stated that she thought it was only fair my 25-year-old male colleague was paid more. Excellent, okay. Copying work, taking credit. Yeah, people speaking to male colleagues before women. Assumption that I couldn't travel or wouldn't want to travel because I have young children. So benevolence bias for women with children comes up an awful lot. An expectation that I'll be having kids soon. 33. And no plans at the moment. Hilarious. The thing is when people think you're going to be cheeky enough to have another one when you've just come back. So bias, it's out there, and it's not a criticism. We're not pointing the finger. Everybody who's human is biased to some extent. We've all judged a book by its cover. While we're waiting, a very quick example that I've done, even though I train in this, was I was delivering a session, ironically, on bias for a client in the classroom. And I hate to say it, but there was a young female grad sitting at the back, and she was very, very quiet. And in my unconscious mind, I wired her gender, her age, and her quietness together and thought that was the reason. So when I mixed it up to do an activity and I invited her down to sit with two senior male colleagues, I thought she would continue to be quiet. So they said, would you like to sit here? And she said, no, thank you. I think I ought to sit in the middle, and I'd like the pad and the pen. And I was really surprised. And she was just in reflective mode when she was sitting at the back, and when we got into action mode, she switched gears. So we can all be biased to some extent, but collectively, I really do believe we can break the bias. So for those of you who don't know Skills4, I'm Jayne, I'm the CEO, and I set up the business 16 years ago now, behind the vision of living in a world where everybody feels safe, psychologically safe, to bring their true self to work. And I know through my experience, and most of you on the call will know through your experience, that we're not there yet, and bias can be a big blocker to this vision. So what we have lined up is a 20-minute session max. So I appreciate you joining us today. It's most days are busy, especially International Women's Day. But I'm going to share a simple framework that we can all do. Every single person on this call can contribute towards breaking the bias. And I'm also going to share some tips to help reduce bias on an individual level, as that was some of the questions we got leading into it. So some specific examples that I've heard more than once in my 15 years of training women is, as we've had in the chat, she won't want that role. She has young children. She doesn't look like a lesbian. That's been said to me several times, which is remarkable. Or I don't know how you do this job with 3 young children. You're in luck. We need more girls on this project. We had a brilliant alumni speaker last week, Rebecca Ben from Alpha Beta, talking about neurodiversity, but she'd been told she was too smart to be dyslexic. And then that reminded me of the phrase that I hear too often to women, it's reserved for women, you're a smart cookie. So if we look at some of those comments, we come to the question then, how can we break the bias in our organisations? And training is a great place to start, but training has to change hearts and minds before it can change behaviours. And for that, I always say, if budget permits, facilitated training over e-learning is always going to be better, because you can have the dialogue and you can have the debate. Last year, a big report came out, and unconscious bias got a bit of bad press because the report indicated or implied that unconscious bias training didn't work as a standalone. But I think what some people heard was unconscious bias training doesn't work. It does work, but it's only the starting point. When I work with organisations, we often look at the culture and people say, we've had unconscious bias training and it's been great, but. So where do we go from there? And the answer really has to be about embedding this awareness into our organisational culture. So when we look at our organisations, we know how to keep our employees physically safe. We all take health and safety very seriously. But the question then is, what about our psychological safety? And if we look at our sector of engineering and construction, can you imagine if health and safety was just done or discussed once a year? It doesn't even bear thinking about. So we need to treat psychological safety with the same importance as we do people's physical safety. And how that works really is embedding it into the culture with a zero tolerance approach. So some best practice across many of my clients is adopting a zero tolerance approach, the same way they do to physical health and safety. Recruiting and supporting equality, diversity and inclusion champions. However, those champions need to be supported. They need to have resource, or at the very least, a code to allocate that work to. They shouldn't just be expected to volunteer or do it in their own time. Lots of companies now are bringing on board mental health first aiders as well as physical first aiders. Training in ED&I and psychological safety and bias as part of every new recruit's induction. Regular refresher training rather than just the annual training. Regular diversity and inclusion moments in team meetings and briefings, and utilising the free resource of visual signage and reminders. So this could be a poster campaign within your offices, it could be strap lines on your website and your company literature, and it could even be things like company screensavers to remind people about breaking the bias. And International Women's Week, with that being the theme, is a great opportunity to jump on that. But when we talk about breaking the bias, the real way to approach this is we have to call it out. And we need to call it out for ourselves when we're on the receiving end, and also as an act of allyship for others. And I know sometimes people say, well, it's kind of awkward. How do you call it out? Does it become a big thing? I wanted to call it out, but I missed the opportunity. So here is a really simple tool that I'd like you to use and I'd like you to share. And it's a 1, 2, 3 framework. Number 1, clarify. Start with a question, an open question, so that you understand where the other person is coming from. Check you haven't misunderstood them, because that could get awfully messy. And then number 2, just call it out. Call it out as bias communication or bias behaviour. And I'm going to rework some examples. And then 3 is important. I think we then need to close the conversation so it's just not hanging around like a bad smell. There has to be a purpose, there has to be a point. That could be a desired outcome, what you'd like to happen next, or it could just be moving the conversation on. So those 3 C's can play out like this. Our first example, she won't want that role, she has young children. The first C is clarify. Have you spoken with her directly about the opportunity, and see what the person has to say? Then we call it out. If they haven't, then we say, well, that's a big assumption. I think she'd be great in the role. And the close is discuss the opportunity with her and get her views. Another example, somebody says to me she doesn't look like a lesbian. The first thing I'm going to do is clarify. What do you mean by that? And the beautiful thing about this 3Cs, this simple framework, is you're giving people space to realise their own bias rather than jumping in and pointing it out to them. Whenever I've said to somebody, what do you mean by that? They've very rarely said, well, I think a lesbian should look like this. They've immediately said, okay, I get it. That's inappropriate. However, if they did go on to say that, then I would just call it out. I'd say, I feel uncomfortable with such stereotypical comments. And the close would be, I think you should keep comments like that to yourself going forward. And another example is, I don't know how you do this job with 3 young children. I've had that with me. I've got 2 children, but there you go. I don't know how you do this as a single mum with 2 children. Clarify what makes you say that. And again, this person then may claim down. If they don't and they say, well, work and we do this and you've got your home life, call it out. And here you might want to say something like, I suspect you haven't raised this with any of the men who have children. And then to close the conversation, it may not be an outcome. It may just be, I have no issues balancing my work and home life. I get a lot from both. So in terms of 5 minutes, that is such a simple tool. When you hear bias, when you receive bias comments, or when you see them happening to other people, there are 3 simple things you can do. Clarify, call it out, close the conversation. Collectively, we have to break the bias. It can't sit with a small few. So after this session, go and practice that tool. We'll see from the chat, it doesn't take long to find bias comments. Please use the tool and please share it with your teams. We're going to send you this recording and the slides. It's International Women's Day today, but there's events going on all week. So if you can influence this and use it with your team, then happy days. We've done a good thing. A couple of things, and then I'll just see if Elizabeth had any poignant questions, but I think we've covered most of them. We were asked for tips to reduce bias on an individual level. And although we haven't got time to do a training session, these would be my top 5. Anybody who knows anything about bias is it's unconscious, so it's quick. So the top tip is be more self-aware and slow down. When you're tired, your moral muscle is the first thing to go. So don't make any people decisions after lunch when you're tired. And conversely, if you have a career conversation or a PDR coming up on a Friday afternoon, try and swap it for a Monday morning or a Tuesday morning. Look at how work and one-to-one support is allocated, either by you or in your department. Where are the patterns? I always say to people, consciously give a stretch task to every member of your team at least once. At best, you double your resource. At worst, you've at least been fair and shared out opportunity. This is a real key one. Step back and assess the diversity of your personal and professional network. I did that 5 years ago and I realised I had a lot of work to do. And get out of your comfort zone. Spend time with people who are different to you. Look for reverse mentoring opportunities. Or reduce your blind spot and take the Harvard implicit test. The link's on here and Annie's also sharing it in the chat today. So my view would be to say, we've had such a short session. Thank you so much for joining us. The recording of this webinar and the slides will be shared with all attendees so that you can go and use the tools and share the tools. And really, it's a case of sharing the tools so that we can break the bias and create psychologically safe and successful organisations. Elizabeth, was there anything pressing in the chat?
No, you're very quiet. Please, you've got a very brief time to just send something in the chat room if there's anything.
No, I think we should all just go and decide who we're going to share this with, have a quick cup of tea and think we've got off lightly with an effective focus to break the bias session.
It's brilliant, Jayne. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good afternoon.